Thanks, Graham.
Jay, you were introduced briefly before you're able to arrive. Just to recap a little bit of what Christopher said, I know you weren't able to hear this.
Thanks.
Certainly a different context for Europe relative to Canada because of being blessed with a lack of resources, quite the contrasting position. Policy frame around three primary targets: sustainability, security, and competitiveness. Original targets set by the EU, 20% each for CO2 reduction, also for penetration of renewables, and also for energy efficiency. And what Christopher modestly claimed was the gold standard in energy efficiency being established in Europe because of labeling and the aggressive targets that have been set. So with that background, and given our time allowance, if you could share about 10 minutes worth of thoughts with us, then we'll proceed with questions.
I thought you were going to say 2.
10 is good. Please proceed.
Yeah, I'm always ready with my elevator pitch. Being the energy policy guy in Canada, it's a pretty easy pitch to make, but maybe I'll just start with this. Chris and I had, I hope I can call you Chris, but we had a terrific conversation yesterday, and we really appreciate the European Union being here in force, talking to us about Canada's international energy agenda. And yeah, right away to say ditto, and I know that's going to sound like duplication and may bore some people, but the fact is that our two agendas are very complementary, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I thought this anecdote, I thought I'd share it with you folks, because it really shocked me yesterday in the meeting. Chris is really making a seminal point, right? That the future is now. And he put a ton of data on the table for me that kind of made me go, I know it's real, but it's really real. And one of the things he said, and you want to talk about complementary agendas, I hope I have this right, Chris, it's just from memory, but he said, if you really amortize everything, we have to decarbonize fossil fuels. In other words, and I think it was by 2025 or something, I can't remember the time frame, 25 or 30. And if you think about that, we have to have zero carbon fossil fuels. And there are ways to do that. And so, and guess what? Carbon capture and storage we're really interested in because we see innovation as part of that whole agenda. And to me, if you want to crystallize it, if I had 2 minutes, I would say right there is something that makes our two agendas aligned. And so, Canada has its roots in Europe. There's no question. We need to acknowledge the fact that there's lots to learn from each other. But the two-way traffic is very simple for us. It's a little bit like our relationship with the United States, and I think we'd be foolhardy not to acknowledge the fact that the founding nations, whether they be 2 or 3, and I know the Indigenous question is out there these days, but we have very easy links with Europe, and as a result, we have our roots there, and as a result, our energy agendas do complement one another. There are things like CETA and SPA that are at the forefront of discussions these days, and I remain hopeful, and I think the Prime Minister does, I think my Minister does, the government does, that these things will sort of bear fruit as we go forward. And so we look forward to working with Europe on that. But just coming back to, the agenda of Canada and partnerships, we talked a lot yesterday about the richness of supply and diversity that Canada has in terms of energy. And you all know that. I guess I'm preaching to the converted, but it's never lost on me that that's an important point, because oftentimes in our mosaic, there's been an emphasis on one energy source or one energy paradigm over another. And I think what I would just tell you is that my lens into the energy file for Canada, for those here from Europe or fellow Canadians, is I've been sitting in this chair for energy policy guy for 3.5 years, something like that. Prior to that, I owned another slice of it for 5 years. So watching it for a long time, I think it's time for us to frame it around international and domestic. And the fact is that time is now that the world is calling out to Canada, and that is not just Europe, it's Asia, it's North America, to play a much bigger role in terms of energy diplomacy. And so that means that we have to emphasize all facets of what we do well, and we do energy well, right? Canada does energy really well, And I really want people to understand that. I know Chris does. He was asking me for stuff yesterday. And we need to explain to Canadians that we do that. And by that, I mean we need to get right deep into the subsectors, which means everything from hydro and renewables, electricity, nuclear, to oil and gas. And stop the emphasis on, geez, there's just one or another, and there's issues to deal with. For sure, we all know there are issues to deal with. So international and domestic, meaning Canada wants to play a role. Your point about energy security is a very good one. People in this room may or may not know, but we recently worked with our colleagues in the United States, Bud, you know this really well, to do some work in Ukraine. And it actually was not a whole lot that we actually had to do in terms of resource investment, but I'm amazed with the kind of payback that, or at least the feedback that we got out of those initiatives, meaning trying to help Ukraine with the Gazprom issue, working jointly with the United States and the EU in terms of how can we better help them develop their indigenous sources of supply? How can we help them conserve energy? How can we help them through the mapping processes figure out what's going on? How can we look at tariff and trade barriers and so on and so forth to implement? How can we achieve market access in Canada to provide them supply of gas? So when you think about everything I just said, it's again mirroring the first point that we have a lot of richness and strength, and we need to kind of leverage that in the international community. And yesterday, that conversation played out in real time, in my view. And one of the biggest, as you underscored as I was walking in, was, geez, it's not just about supply, it's also demand. And you know, when you think about the bifurcation after international and domestic, if you see my frame, then we've got domestic and it's supply and demand. Canada's got richness on the demand side, but Europe has a lot to teach us. That is very clear. I was not fully aware of how much Europe has done on financing. I don't know how many people in this room know about energy efficiency and financing in Europe, but there is something that, you know, I think all parts of the sector need to kind of explore a little bit more. And I did know about Japan, which is interesting. I don't know why I know so much about Japan and so little about Europe, but the fact is that these guys have figured out way better ways of making that a competitive business. And we have things to learn there. But having said all of that, where are we in Canada right now? In terms of the world we're targeting, we're looking at North America as our clear area for strength, you know, sort of a regional perspective of international energy relationships. So, and that really, I think, plays to the point about security, energy security. We think that North America has a massive role to play there for the world. In terms of Europe and Asia, it's a two-way kind of perspective. There's a lot of market access issues that come up in those dialogues, and we recognize that. Likewise, Canada's worth investing in, right? Somebody would tell you in my department that we have $700 billion of potential projects sitting right underneath our noses that require capital. And so, you know, we aim to be competitive in that regard. At the same time, we have to take very seriously, and this is the art of the impossible that you're putting out there, the 35-year horizon, which is not that far off, a low carbon transition. So in terms of our domestic agenda, my minister, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to do that. All ministers in this government have published, and I don't know if Europe does this, but I'm pretty proud of this little fact, their mandate letters. And up until like the last 100 years, those things were held very tightly. You know, this notion of cabinet confidence and et cetera, it's flipped around on a dime. This government has made it very transparent about what its goals and objectives are and aims to achieve them. So when you think about the mandate letter, if you would go through it quickly, I'll paraphrase because it's quite lengthy and well written, but probably internationally I've covered it. We definitely need to achieve market access while playing a primary role on climate change and reducing our carbon footprint. Domestically, to do that, there's the Canadian energy strategy. And we had lived with a little bit of hope that we would be off and running on a Canadian energy strategy with the provinces. You may or may not know, but the provinces are subnational governments to you guys, are deep into their own energy strategy, and we need to catch up. That's about the last decade, and they decided to go off. But this government absolutely wants to work hand in glove with the provinces on a national perspective. So another thing that Christopher told me yesterday was, you know, and we were just recently in India with the minister, same thing around the world, right? Vision is to develop our assets, taking into account low carbon transition, but also the need to have good economic returns. I think those were 2 of the 3 points that you put on the table that drive your agenda. The issue is how do you achieve it? And I guess in Europe, you guys have set these massive targets, which is great. We don't work that way. We have a sort of an asymmetrical system, but it's time. And I believe the minister has been talking a lot about let us at least have a pathway forward to 2040. And I think you'll be seeing something. Many of you in the room will be invited, I think, to a symposium, maybe around mid-mandate, to talk about that. What does it really mean? Like, what does it mean in percentage terms? Chris is an amazing quester for data. And he can tell you right away, you know, like the Indians told me last week, we're going to be 30% nuclear by 2025, and not knocking India or anything like that, but, you know, like that's very aspirational, let's be clear. Whereas Europe is already halfway towards meeting its objective, and they have a monitoring and tracking system, right? That's what you were telling me yesterday. So we need to do the same here in Canada to set that agenda, and we will. But at the moment, we live in an asymmetrical system. That diversity is also our strength. The fact is we have many provinces who've developed areas of strength that, you know, if I go across the country, everywhere from oil and gas on the east to hydro, sorry, on the west, did I really just say that? On the west to hydro on the east. And we're working hard to make sure that those things get developed. Canadian energy strategy, when we finally sign on to it, as we make our way forward through the Pan-Canadian framework on climate change, will reap dividends and start the ball in motion there. We are heavily invested in clean tech and innovation. This government is, through its last budget, put a ton of dollars into that system. And if I don't see innovation on a stage, you guys should shoot me. I hope you guys are all saying innovation for Canada as well. It is super important. It is super important that we continue to show the pathway forward of how we can do this well as Canadians. And I'm all ears. If you have things you want to tell me, or that I should be working on with the EU when it comes to innovation, there's a big partnership that can happen around this, whether it be on demand or supply. I think in the oil and gas industry, we really need to take a hard look at that, and I'm constantly questing for that. I think Europe is looking for us to do that, and that plays right into the market access equation. So, you know, in other words, if we're going to supply, and everybody knows about the FKD story, so I don't want to go there, but if we're going to supply Europe with good oil and gas resources, they're also going to want to know we're doing everything possible to reduce the carbon footprint of developing that. So I'd say innovation, priority number 2. Working in North America and international, priority number 3. Working with Indigenous peoples, absolutely primordial. I think we've recognized that public confidence and the way to path forward to those $700 billion worth of projects is certainly an acceptance by Indigenous peoples that these projects will happen. And then, I guess finally, you may or may not know, but we have a lot of good regulatory practices that we are bringing forward. We are already strong on the regulatory and environmental protection side, but the government has a domestic agenda of ensuring that resources are developed sustainably. And so that means a review of all of our regulatory processes. I know I went on and on about Canada, but I really wanted to make the point that everything I just said right now, those 5 or 6 items, they are completely linked to the agenda that Europe has. And I think that makes life very interesting. So yesterday, to make it very practical, I knew right away when you guys were talking about the financing of energy efficiency in the Spain example you threw on the table, that we've made that mistake and that you guys have gone way past that, and we need to find better ways to finance these projects. Likewise, I knew right away that we've developed some Indigenous areas of expertise like carbon capture and storage that you guys would be very interested in. And we went through a series of action items, because that's what it's all about, right? At the end of the day, it's not about just kind of sitting on the stage and signing MOUs. It is about government-to-government connections, business-to-business connections, regulator-to-regulator connections, and in some cases, science-to-science. And then you develop action plans. We have a beginning of that between the EU and Canada, and I look forward to working on that agenda as we go forward. I think the leaders, if and when they meet, will relish the fact that we're thinking about all of this. I'd be remiss if I obviously didn't talk about what's ever present on my agenda right now, which is the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change. And I think in there, if you look at the nugget of energy efficiency, There's a lot for the world to teach us, and we would look to invite you to participate with us to make sure Canada is kept in check and it's doing everything it can to implement its transition to 2040 effectively. With that, I want to be informed by you folks. If we've missed anything on our agenda in terms of complementarity, if there's an area of emphasis that we ought to be pursuing in an action-oriented way, then you please let us know. Because my minister, and I told him this yesterday about 5 times, will not want me to get engaged in a dialogue that goes into a zone of, oh, good, it was nice to see you, let's talk again in a year. It has to be meaningful, it has to have outcomes, and it has to be oriented around progress in terms of the win-win for both sides. So thank you for that. And I don't know if I took 10 minutes, but hopefully I saved you some time.
Thank you very much, Jay, and also Christopher for your remarks. I think the theme of the session very much focused on differences, similarities, and common interests, and you've both covered those categories very well. One area that neither spoke of in any detail was, I'll use colloquial language here, keeping the public with us as all this moves ahead. Christopher and I chatted before the session started today, and I had the sense that it was very much a top-down engagement that happened in Europe, and that Europe got it, or European people got it. At the same time, there's price pressure due to electricity, etc. Jay, I'm not sure we're at the same stage of engagement in energy with the public in general, and by consequence, some of the issues that we're confronting, it may be price or it may be pushback on a particular project, isn't quite there. So I'm going to ask you each to speak just very briefly about that point, and then I'd like to open the floor for questions. So please be ready with a question or two. Everybody can see the clock in the upper left or the upper right side of the room. We're good until 5 to 11, and we'll keep strictly to that time. So just a brief comment, if you would, on having the public stay with us and put shoulders behind this, which makes it easier ultimately for our political leaders to move ahead.
Do you want me to start? Sure. We actually talked about this yesterday. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I would sort of talk about public confidence in a moment. But, you know, it's not a day goes by that I don't open up the clips and sort of realize somewhere in the paper, as you do, whether it be front page or second page, that energy isn't one of the top news stories, right, for the country. And usually that sort of emanates from this question of public confidence, those stories often. So in terms of engagement, I think the minister I report to recognizes this issue very well, and has set down a path by which I think he reflects back on what's happened over the last decade here in terms of developing our sources and engaging the public, and has said, no, we need to engage. So you may or may not know, but the Canadian government, I probably shouldn't put this figure out there, PCO will kill me for this, but there are upwards of about 150 consultations going on right now as we speak under the federal auspices. And so you can't say, the one thing you cannot say is that you're not being engaged. And a lot of those have everything to do with energy and environment, Indigenous, transport, you name it, across innovation, all connected. And so I think this government does recognize that. Secondly, it recently brought into being a whole new set of principles around development, resource development, regulatory principles, but they're really principles that go higher than that. And the biggest of all is consultation and engagement. It recognizes wholly that public confidence is fully established on the fact that people feel like they've been heard. Not necessarily that all views have to be reflected in a decision, ultimately, or a decision should be based on all views, but there's obviously factors that become more significant than others. But at the end of the day, it has put those principles in place. It is modernizing all kinds of pieces of legislation, including, you'll see, you may or may not know, but tucked deep into the mandate letters to modernize the National Energy Board, which is our regulator that has to do with pipelines and transmission lines. It's modernizing the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, Navigation Protection Act, it's consulting on climate change. All of that is in an effort to establish public confidence in my perspective. It perfectly well gets that, you know, at the end of the day, polarization will kill all of this. And that comes directly from my minister. He often says in the public eye, our job here, everybody who's attached to this file, is to try and depolarize things. And I think that's a really important point. So all of the activity that you're seeing right now is exactly based on that point. Just last point, we have also strong regulatory measures that we brought in when it comes to safety and security. And I didn't want to lose that point. It's kind of really important in the Canadian context. Lac Megantic sits in the back of all of this, all the black swans, Macondo, you can go on, Fukushima. We take that stuff very seriously, and the federal government has a ton of legislation that it's worked on in the last little while. Pipeline Safety Act, Energy Safety Security Act, that puts in place the conditions that we think create the confidence that Canadians can have in the development.
Christopher, do you have a brief comment on public engagement?
Let me tell you a story.
Uh-oh.
A country called Finland. Quite a few years ago, it was pretty much dependent on Russia for its electricity supplies. Now, it doesn't take much to realize this is a bad plan. I said Europe was not very lucky in terms of natural resources. Finland is probably even less, with the exception of a certain amount of hydro, which is limited now. And so the government decided that, okay, let's go nuclear. Let's build a new nuclear plant. And of course, this was post-Chernobyl. And this was a period where many other countries were saying, no, let's close down nuclear. So how do you do it? You spend a period whereby you have an honest engagement with your citizens, saying, this is the problem, these are the options. What do you think? What you don't say is, this is the problem, this is the solution, we're doing it. And over a period of 3 or 4 years, because you had this debate in the country about, because energy, the problem is so many people with energy say, there is a perfect solution. There is never a perfect solution. It's either too expensive or it's too dirty, or there's always a negative side to it. So the debate has to be, okay, these are the alternatives and these are the advantages and disadvantages of the alternatives. Now, which one do we as a society want to do? And that's the debate you have to have before you actually get on to, this is how we're going to do it.
Key point. Engage early.
Can,
Folks, are there any questions from the floor? I don't see anyone at the mic. Please go to a mic.